The alien general's name was Dominic Rael, and in 4 centuries of unbroken conquest across 63 star systems, he had never once ordered a retreat. But standing in his command center at 1,400 hours, watching his 9th consecutive battalion get systematically dismantled by a single human soldier operating on no sleep, no food, critically low blood volume, and what his medical officer described as injuries that should have produced unconsciousness approximately 4 hours ago, he was beginning to genuinely reconsider his life choices. Because the human, Sergeant First Class Dominic Rael, age 31, Third War, previously listed as Kia in the second one, which should have been the galaxy's first warning sign, had now been fighting continuously for 11 hours against forces that outnumbered him by roughly 3,000 to 1. And not only was he still alive, he was adapting, getting better as the battle went on, learning the patterns of each new wave faster than the previous one, stripping weapons from fallen soldiers, using the terrain with the kind of intimate familiarity that only came from having memorized every shadow and sightline before the first shot was ever fired. And the truly maddening part, the part that had Dominic Rael's entire senior staff standing in silence staring at drone feeds with expressions ranging from professional concern to barely concealed existential dread, was the laughing, because the human laughed, not the desperate broken laughter of a man losing his mind under pressure, but the genuine full-throated laughter of someone who was, against all biological and tactical logic, enjoying himself. And Dominic Rael had conquered species that built their entire civilizations around warfare, had broken armies with traditions stretching back 10,000 years, had faced enemies who fought with religious fervor and chemical rage and suicidal devotion, and none of them, not a single one, had ever looked at his forces and laughed like the odds were a joke someone had told specifically for their entertainment, which was why when his youngest staff officer, fresh from the academy, still operating under the assumption that wars followed logical rules, asked the entirely reasonable question of why the human didn't simply retreat since the outpost was already lost and there was nothing left to strategically defend. Dominic Rael didn't answer immediately, instead pulling up Dominic Rael's full service record on the central display and letting her read it herself, watching her expression shift as she moved through it. The first war at age 19, where he'd earned 3 commendations and a psychological evaluation note that said, demonstrates unusual comfort in high-stress combat environments. The second war where his entire unit was wiped out and he spent 42 days alone behind enemy lines before walking out carrying classified intelligence and 2 wounded soldiers from a different unit he'd found along the way. The Kia listing that lasted 6 days before someone realized the body count didn't add up. The third war, which was this one, which was now, which was 11 hours into a one-man defense of a position with no strategic value anymore except the strategic value of the human having decided it was his and apparently being constitutionally incapable of leaving something that was his simply because the mathematics had turned unfavorable. And when his staff officer finished reading and looked up with the slightly unfocused expression of someone whose understanding of the universe had just been gently revised, she said, "Sir, why does he keep fighting when there's no logical reason to?" And Dominic Rael said, "Because nobody told him to stop." Which wasn't a complete answer but was the truest one he had, because the thing the galaxy kept getting wrong about humans, the thing every species learned eventually in the hardest possible way, was the assumption that humans fought the way everyone else fought, which was to say within parameters, within calculations of acceptable loss and strategic viability and the point at which continuing became irrational. But humans hadn't evolved with that governor installed, or if they had, 10,000 years of clawing survival on a planet that was actively trying to kill them at every level had ground it down to nothing. Because Earth wasn't a gentle world. Earth was a world of mass extinctions and ice ages and predators that could kill you 9 different ways before breakfast. And the species that had survived it hadn't done so by calculating acceptable loss. They'd done so by refusing, on some deep cellular level, to accept that loss was ever fully acceptable, which produced a soldier like Dominic Rael who at hour 12 of continuous combat, bleeding from 9 distinct wounds, running on approximately 4 hours of sleep from 2 days prior, having eaten nothing since a ration bar at 0400, received a priority signal from the human military command informing him that extraction was not possible and he should attempt to evade and survive, and responded with a transmission of exactly 4 words: "I'll take it under advisement," before going back to fortifying a position he'd already decided he wasn't leaving. Not because he hadn't understood the order, not because he was incapable of retreat, but because retreat required him to walk away from something that was his, and Dominic Rael did not walk away from things that were his, a character trait that had earned him medals and psychological evaluation flags in roughly equal measure throughout his career. And Voreth Kell knew all of this because he'd spent the last 3 hours reading everything available on the human while his battalions reduced themselves against the man's defenses, studying him the way you studied an enemy you respected. Which Voreth Kell absolutely did by this point, whatever else he felt about the situation, and what the file told him was that this was not an exceptional human in the way the galaxy usually meant exceptional. Dominic Rael had not been genetically engineered or cybernetically enhanced or trained in some secret program that produced super soldiers. He was just a human being who had been pointed at war young enough that it had become the primary language he spoke. A man who understood violence the way musicians understood music. Intuitively and completely and without the distance that made most beings hesitate. And the hesitation was the thing. Voreth Kell kept coming back to the hesitation. Because his soldiers hesitated. All soldiers hesitated. It was a survival mechanism. The pause between seeing danger and responding while the brain ran its calculations. And Dominic Rael did not appear to have that pause. Or if he had it, it was so compressed as to be functionally invisible. He moved through combat the way water moved through channels, instantly filling whatever space presented itself, adapting in real time to information that would have paralyzed a normal soldier with the sheer volume of it. And at hour 13, his medical officer came to Voreth Kell with a physiological analysis of the drone footage and said, "Sir, based on observed movement patterns and the wounds, we can confirm this human should be in hemorrhagic shock." And Voreth Kell said, "And yet," and his medical officer said, "And yet," and they stood together looking at the feed where Dominic Rael was currently using a piece of debris as a fulcrum to collapse a section of wall onto a flanking unit with the calm precision of a man doing a job he'd done many times before. And Voreth Kell thought about the human concept he'd studied in preparation for this campaign. The concept they called running on spite, which humans used half-jokingly to describe continuing past the point of reasonable endurance purely through the force of not being willing to let the universe win. And he thought that there was probably more literal truth in that phrase than the humans themselves realized. That spite was perhaps actually a survival mechanism. The final governor when all other systems had been pushed past their limits. The thing that kept the body moving when the body had every biological reason to stop. And Dominic Rael appeared to have an essentially bottomless supply of it, because at hour 14 he broadcast on an open channel, no encryption, every frequency, and his voice was tired in the way geological formations were tired, deep and old and completely immovable. And he said, "I'm going to give you 10 minutes and then I'm coming to find your command post. This is professional courtesy. Last time I didn't offer it and someone submitted a formal complaint through 3 levels of command, which I found both impressive and excessive." And the entire command center went silent because the human was threatening their position from a location he had no business still being alive in. And Voreth Kell's aide said, "Sir, is he serious?" And Voreth Kell said, "Yes," very quietly, and began issuing evacuation orders. Because he had read the file, and the file said that Dominic Rael had done exactly this once before, had promised something that seemed physically impossible given his situation and then done it anyway purely through the application of forward momentum and the refusal to process can't as a real category. And Voreth Kell was not a being who became attached to command posts. He had conquered 63 star systems by being adaptable. And adaptability right now meant not being in the place an injured unstoppable human had promised to reach in 10 minutes. And so they evacuated, And as his ship lifted out of atmosphere, Voreth Kell looked down at the smoke rising from the ruins of that outpost and thought about what the briefing documents had said about human military history, about the Orion conflict and what humanity had done when pushed to its absolute limit. And he thought about how the galaxy had looked at that and decided humans were too dangerous and banned them from warfare for 300 years. And he thought about how that ban had apparently done nothing except ensure that when a human soldier finally went to war again, it was because something had pushed hard enough to make it personal. And personal was the worst thing you could make it with a human, because impersonal wars had limits. Impersonal wars had the calculations of cost and benefit and strategic viability. But personal wars had only the question of whether you were still breathing. And as long as the answer was yes, the human would keep coming. And below him in the ruins, Dominic Rael watched the ships leave the atmosphere one by one with the patience of a man who had learned that patience and stubbornness were the same thing viewed from different angles. And he was bleeding from 11 wounds by the final count. His armor was structural nonsense held together by wire and the sheer optimism of its remaining components. He had 6 rounds left and 1 working knee and was running a core temperature that his suit's medical system kept flagging as a critical emergency in increasingly alarmed tones that he had muted 4 hours ago. And he watched the last ship disappear beyond the clouds and sat down against a broken wall and laughed. Not because it didn't hurt. It absolutely hurt. It hurt in ways he was going to need a very long conversation with a medical professional to fully inventory. But because they were gone and he was here, and that was the only scoreboard that had ever mattered to him. And 3 weeks later, when the rescue team found him, he was delirious from blood loss and had spent the intervening time apparently fortifying the ruins, in case they came back, surviving on rainwater and scavenged supplies. And the medic who treated him, hands not entirely steady, asked how he'd held off an army alone for 3 weeks. And Dominic Rael thought about it with the seriousness the question deserved and said, "Kept it simple." And she said, "Simple how?" And he closed his eyes and said, "Every morning I woke up and every morning they weren't here yet. So I figured I was winning." And she didn't have anything to say to that, because it was the most human answer she'd ever heard. And also somehow the most complete tactical philosophy she'd encountered in 8 years of military medicine. And in his command ship crossing the dark between stars, Voreth Kell filed his after-action report, and in the section marked, "Lessons Learned," he wrote 1 sentence. Because 1 sentence was enough. Because everything else was just detail around that one central fact that the galaxy kept forgetting and kept relearning in Blood and Fire and the wreckage of battalions sent against things they didn't understand. Do not make it personal with a human, because humans do not have an off switch for personal. They have only forward.